Is it on?
The main thing is if you can be here to rescue me when I
Not a problem.
crash the system.
This is on.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to another presentation on Alaska's fiscal issues. Fairbanks Economic Development, the Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce has been putting on a series of events to talk about Alaska's fiscal issues. As you know, we collectively believe that this is something that we need to resolve. We need to move forward. We need to develop a state's economy that is sustainable. So in an effort to bring information to Fairbanks and others, today we have invited Gunnar Knapp to Fairbanks. Gunnar is a professor emeritus of economics from the Institute of Social Economic Research at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Gunnar has worked at ICER in the past from 1981 to 2016. He was director of ICER from 2013 to 2016. Gunnar has worked on numerous projects around the state. Gunnar is married with 3 children. Interesting fact about Gunnar, he's a trained classical singer. He has sung at the Anchorage Opera. He also participates in the Anchorage Cross Country Ski Organization, and Gunnar speaks Swedish. So with that, I've convinced him to speak in English today. And Gunnar, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Testing? Yeah. So hi, folks. My name is Gunnar Knapp, and I am a professor emeritus of economics at, which means I'm retired from UAA's Institute of Social and Economic Research, commonly known as ICER. I want to start out by thanking the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation for bringing me up here on such a beautiful day, and the flight up here is just beautiful day. You know, as an Anchorage resident, it's always a thrill to travel to Alaska. Very briefly, I just want to tell you briefly about me and kind of where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to do. So as you heard, I'm a former ICER director and professor of economics, and you know, I worked there for 35 years. Towards the end of my career, I worked extensively on Alaska fiscal issues and the fiscal challenges that our state is facing. And I retired about 8 months ago, and so now I'm a professor emeritus. All of the work that I'm doing these days on fiscal issues is voluntary. Nobody's paying me. I'm not out shilling for anybody. I'm speaking for myself. And why am I doing this? It's my attempt to sort of provide some service to the state of Alaska, to continue to use the expertise I've had the opportunity to to gather over the course of my career, to sort of try to make that still help with this thing. In the analysis that I'm doing and the talks that I'm giving like today, I am not here to advocate for any particular fiscal choice. I personally strongly believe that reasonable people differ widely on how we should address our fiscal crisis that we're facing in this state. I respect people across a wide variety of opinions about what we should do and how we should go. I think that essentially we face very important political choices, and reasonable people can disagree about what those are. I'm not here to advocate for my whatever my opinion is. I happen to have one, but I'm not here to advocate for that. What I am trying to do is help Alaskans understand the situation that we face so that people can make and allow lots of time for discussion and questions and commentary. But it's it's a challenge and a big and complicated issue like this to think, well, what should I focus on and what should I talk about? So I'm going to sort of talk about a mix of things. First, I want to give a brief introduction to what's probably familiar to most of you, but not necessarily to everybody, a brief introduction to what is the fiscal challenge that we face. And then I want to, because I think it's useful and important, take a brief look back at our Alaska's fiscal history. Where have we come from to get to where we are today? Then I want to talk, and probably the most sort of nerdy or complex part of this presentation, about a way of framing our fiscal options. And finally, I want to add a few final comments about some of the options we face. Okay, so let's start with a brief introduction to our Alaska fiscal challenge. Now, part of the problem that we face when talking about Alaska's finances is they're just plain complex. They're complex. It's not easy to understand and talk about our finances, partly because we have many different kinds of revenues and many different kinds of spending, and you can, and sort of they're all relevant, but they're relevant in different ways, and to sort of talk about everything and the gap between our unrestricted general fund revenues and our spending. But the issues come back to relate to other kinds of revenues and spending. So here are, this table shows the, can you see this? Does this thing shine a pointer? It's too small. Anyway, this table shows where the state's revenues are coming from this year, this fiscal year that we're in, FY17. And we have 4 different kinds of revenues that the state categorizes. And unrestricted general fund revenues are shown in the column shown in red. That's the money the state can use any way it wants. Okay? But then we've got a variety of restricted revenues, which are kinds of revenues that, at least historically, we haven't been unrestricted in how we could use them. There's been limitations or restrictions on how we could use them. The most obviously restricted is federal funding. The federal government gives the state of Alaska a lot of money, but it's for specific purposes. And they say, here's money for transportation, here's money for education, here's money for healthcare, and you have to use it in that way. You can't go and use that money for troopers or kindergarten teachers or whatever else you might want to use it for. It's restricted. Another kind of restricted money is designated general fund revenue. That's money that the state collects for a designated purposes. And 2 examples are university tuition and marine highway tickets sales, okay? So that's money the state collects, and yeah, we could take the tuition money that university students pay and use that to pay for state troopers or fix the roads or whatever, but the students probably wouldn't appreciate it. Okay, they expect that money to be used for the university. So it's money we take in, but it's not really money that's available for purposes other than what we take in. And then finally, we have this other restricted revenue, and that is the most confusing, because the biggest part of other restricted revenue is our investment revenues. And in particular, the biggest part of that is the investment earnings of the permanent fund. Now, why have we called those restricted? They are restricted, quote, by custom. We have not been accustomed in the past to using permanent fund earnings to pay for government. We went, almost with 30 years with those earnings being considered restricted, not available to fund government. But of course, the legislature can spend the earnings of the permanent fund for government or any purpose they want anytime by a simple majority vote. And so the critical issue we are facing today is whether the time has come, and if so, how and how much, to use some of these permanent fund earnings to help pay for government. So we've tended to talk about our revenues as if, well, this year's revenues are only 1.6 billion. That's 1.6 billion in traditional unrestricted general fund revenues. I would say revenue, but you see, if you look at these numbers, that it gets pretty confusing. How much money does the state have this year? 1.6 billion or 10 billion? The answer is they're both right, but they're right in different ways. Okay. Okay, now, with that introduction about why it's complex, let's go on to sort of the basic facts of our fiscal challenge. We have been extremely dependent on oil for our unrestricted general fund revenues. From 2005 to 2014, oil revenues accounted for 90% of our unrestricted general fund revenues that pay for the basic government services. But our state revenues are extremely sensitive to oil prices, and particularly production taxes, which are based on oil company profits. And this graph here shows the sensitivity and how much money the state would take in FY17 for different oil prices. And you can see that depending upon the oil price, a small change, how much money we take in varies drastically. But what's important for people who are sort of watching the oil price sort of perk along and say, wow, it went from $55 to $56 or something today. At oil prices below about $80, a change in the price doesn't bring us tons more revenue. This line is sort of kinked. And because of the way our tax structure works, when oil prices went down below 80, we didn't lose money as rapidly. The bad news is that unless oil prices go up above 80, we're not going to get money very rapidly. Okay, oil prices fell drastically about 3 years ago and have only risen slightly this year. This is the fundamental immediate factor that's driving the fiscal, the severe fiscal crisis that we presently find ourselves in. And mostly, but not only, there's other factors playing in, mostly but not only because of that fall in prices, our oil revenues have fallen drastically since 2012. We had an $8.1 billion drop in oil revenues from 2012 to 2016, a 91% drop. So what that means is that most of the money that had been paying for almost all of our general fund spending evaporated. And this is what has sort of made this a really humongous, difficult challenge that we've been facing. Okay, now from 2005 to 2012, this graph, let me explain it. The red line shows our unrestricted general fund revenues, and the blue line shows our general fund spending. And when revenues were rising from 2005 kind of up through 2012, we increased our spending, but we didn't increase it by as much as our revenues. So we ran big, sizable surpluses, and we saved a lot of money. Okay? But the problem is that when oil revenues fell drastically, after a year, we began to cut back on our spending. We've cut back our spending fairly significantly, quite a lot. Legislators will point to how much they've reduced spending, but we haven't reduced spending by anywhere near as much as the fall in revenues. And so big surpluses changed into very large deficits. Now, we used the surpluses prior to 2012 to build up our savings reserve funds. Our Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund, another savings reserve fund called the Statutory Budget Reserve Fund, and various other funds that have sort of been designated for particular uses. But since 2013, because these big deficits that we've been running, we've been drawing from these reserve funds, and we've been drawing them down very, very rapidly. And if we pay for this year's deficit by drawing from the Constitutional Budget Reserve Fund, that will be down here at below $4 billion at the end of this fiscal year. And clearly, continued deficits of this year's level could drain these reserves very soon, within a year or so. So this is not a sustainable way to go on doing business. And that's the bad news. But the good news is that we have saved a lot of money in our permanent fund, which is, and the total permanent fund is projected to total $55 billion at the end of FY17. Now, the principal, which is shown in blue in this graph, can't be spent. But the realized earnings, which we've accumulated in the fund, those earnings, remember the legislature can spend the earnings of the permanent fund, and we've spent some of those earnings on dividends, or a lot of them, but we've accumulated a lot in the fund. Those earnings may be spent. So there's a significant amount of money there, and the permanent fund generates additional revenues every year. So the bad news is we've got this huge deficit and shortfall in our oil revenues. The good news is we have a permanent fund that's quite large. Now, that permanent fund generates realized earnings that we can spend, which are shown by this blue line. How have we been using those realized earnings? Well, we've had a dividend formula. We've been paying dividends with those earnings. And the dividend formula is, it's not exactly this, but it's the simplest way to say it is we spend under the dividend formula about half the earnings. About half the earnings. It's just that it's sort of averaged over the 5 previous years. So we have been spending about half the earnings on dividends, and what we've been spending is shown by the brown in this graph. The rest we have been saving in the permanent fund, which has helped the permanent fund to grow so rapidly. And some of the savings in the permanent we have been putting into the principal of the permanent fund and calling those savings inflation proofing. And the other savings we've been adding to the earnings reserve part, the part that can be spent. And those are shown by the different shades of blue here. So key fiscal choices that we face, and a major part of what the debate in the legislature is currently about, is whether and how to begin using how much of these permanent fund earnings to help pay for state government. Okay, that's a key part of our fiscal, sort of debate at the moment. And both the House and Senate have passed bills that would provide a structured way of using a significant share of these earnings to pay for state government. And both of them would reduce the amount that we use to pay for earnings, and so take some of, to pay for dividends. So both the House and Senate's bills would take some of the money that has been going for dividends and add in some of the money that we've been saving and use that to pay for government. And if we do that, and if this goes through as in some way, it'll be a historic moment in Alaska's finances, because we'll have gone from thinking of the permanent fund as a separate fund that is not touched, that's restricted funding, to rather a source of funding government. Okay, that's a brief review of our sort of current fiscal challenge. Now, I want to go back and look at a little bit of where we've come from, because I think it sheds a useful perspective on where we are now. Oil has driven Alaska's economy and state finances for almost 40 years, which is as long as most Alaskans can remember. Most of the people living in Alaska today cannot remember the time before all this oil money started flowing in. Sure, some of them can. A couple of you in this room might even be able to. But most Alaskans are younger, or they came to Alaska since then. For example, me, I came in 1981. I can't remember a time before oil. And it's politically important. People can't remember a time before oil. Now, oil prices, since that oil started flowing, oil prices have fluctuated drastically. And what's happened, and by the way, there are two lines here in this graph. This shows the nominal oil revenues, the value, nominal oil prices in dollars of the day. And this shows the prices adjusted for inflation. Now, I want to make an important point. For any long-term, like more than a decade, comparison of prices or revenues to be meaningful, you have to adjust for inflation. We all know that you couldn't possibly survive today on whatever your salary was, 30 years ago. Prices are, a lot higher. Everything costs a lot more. A dollar today is not worth what a dollar is worth then. So you have to adjust for inflation. And if you adjust for inflation and look at this red line, you can see we had a tremendous boom in oil prices in the early 80s, followed by a drastic crash, and then many years of prices sort of going up and down, but trending downwards to very low levels in the late 1990s, and then suddenly this huge boom in oil prices, and then this precipitous collapse. Okay, so this graph, oil prices, what's happened to oil prices, and the previous graph, what's happened to oil production, are sort of key to our state's fiscal history, because the combined effect of the changes over time in oil production and prices have been drastic fluctuations in the value of the oil produced in Alaska. And this graph shows the value on the West Coast before deducting all the costs of transporting oil to the West Coast and producing the oil and so on. This shows the sort of total value of the oil produced in Alaska. And we can see that that value was highest when prices were really high in the early 80s and production was really high. And it's trended down over time because partly prices trended down and partly because production was steadily declining. And then it shot up again, though not as high in real terms, when oil prices shot up. And then it fell drastically when oil prices fell. Now, those drastic fluctuations in the value of our oil production were reflected in drastic fluctuations in our oil revenues. Now, our oil revenues, it's a whole complex change. Various reasons have changed the amount of oil revenue we get as a share of the value of oil production. But in general, you can see there's been a pretty close relationship. We've had two booms in oil revenue, one in the early 80s and one in the sort of period 2006 to 2014, followed by the middle of declining revenues, and then this drastic decline in the past 3 years. Note that our oil revenues in the last 3 years are lower than they've been at any point since oil production began. However, despite these drastic fluctuations in our oil revenues, going way sky high, falling, going up, going down, all this variation, we were able to fund state government for this entire period almost entirely with oil revenues. Oil accounted for 86% of our total unrestricted general fund revenues from 1980 to 2014. So even though how much money we're getting from oil ranged from huge to much lower in this period, we were able to rely on oil to pay for almost all of our government. And how did we do that? Well, on this graph, I've done two things. First of all, I've changed the graph to show, instead of total value of revenues, revenues per capita, revenues per Alaskan. Because I think that's useful in understanding as you begin to think about spending. Our population essentially doubled over this period. So to have a clear understanding of the level we were spending at, you need to sort of turn it into dollars per Alaskan. And so one, I've done that with the revenues. And second, I've added these two lines that show what our spending was for agency operations, for basic operations of government, and what our total spending was during this period. Now, you could spend a lot of time staring at this graph because there's a tremendous amount to be seen in Alaska's history in this graph, our fiscal history. And those of you who were participants in sort of the fiscal debates over the years can remember the periods when revenues shot up and how we responded, and when revenues fell and how we responded. And basically, what was our fiscal policy during this entire period? This is what our fiscal policy was. One, we didn't add new taxes. We started out by eliminating our income tax very early on with our oil revenues. We didn't add new taxes, and we didn't dip into the permanent fund. What we did was, when revenues went up, we spent more. We spent a lot more. And you notice how, when revenues went up, the difference between the agency spending and the total spending increases. That's because what we tended to spend more on was capital projects. When we increased spending, we would increase the capital projects. And when we had to reduce spending, we would cut back on the capital projects, so the difference increased. So the second thing is, but we also didn't spend all of it. We would run surpluses, and we would save those surpluses. Okay? But then when we had less oil money, we would squeeze back our spending painfully, but we would also run deficits, and we would draw down our savings. Okay? And in this period, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we had a long period of drawing down our savings, sort of similar to that we've been experiencing over the past 3 years. And a lot of people thought, the party can't go on. We're going to have to change. We're going to have to consider new revenues. We're going to have to use permanent fund earnings because it's not sustainable. But then oil prices shot up, our revenues shot up, and we forgot about all that debate and went back up and repeated essentially exactly what we did in the early 80s. But where are we now? Our fundamental fiscal challenge is that it is no longer possible to fund state government almost entirely with oil revenues. Our oil revenues have fallen too much, and we don't have enough savings. Look at where our revenues are today compared with our level of spending. Look at where our level of spending compared to where it's been historically. On a per capita, on a per Alaska basis, it's as low as it's ever been over this entire period of oil wealth, our spending. And yet, our current revenues are drastically lower than they've ever been. You can't cut your way down to this. And something that just boggles my mind is I hear some Alaskans say, we have to live within our means. Well, of course, that's true. You have to live within your means. But that doesn't mean you have to let the price of oil decide how many kids are in your kid's classroom. That doesn't mean that the price of oil has to decide whether your street gets plowed. Other states live within their means. How do they live within their means? Because they tax themselves. They make different decisions about how much they want to tax themselves and what government they want, but you can live within your means as long as you're willing to pay for it. So living within our means does not mean living with what oil can pay for. Although a lot of Alaskans, in 40 years, you can get to thinking that way. Okay, now I want to talk about framing our fiscal options. And this is my attempt to actually say something new, or maybe something new, different that I haven't been talking about in previous presentations, and maybe that's a little new or a little different than what a lot of the fiscal discussion's about. So here goes. We'll see how it works. Most of the discussion of the fiscal challenge has treated unrestricted general fund and permanent fund revenues, spending, and savings separately. And this reflects the reality of how these funds are managed in their historically different purposes. But if you want to frame what's the real long-term options we have and the choices we face, it's useful to think in terms of our combined general fund and permanent fund revenues, spendings, and savings. Let me give you an analogy that maybe will clarify this. Okay, so suppose I'm working for a nice salary, and here's what I do. I have 90% of my paycheck gets deposited in my checking account, and 10% gets deposited in some retirement account. Okay, and suppose I go for many years doing that, and I never touch that retirement account, and it grows and grows and grows, and I pay for my expenses out of my checking account. And then I lose my job. I lose my well-paying job, and suddenly I'm working part-time at a job that pays, 1/10 of what I used to get. Okay, but I don't cut back my expenses. I say, wow, I've got this big checking account. So I go on and on and on, and I just started spending the same way, or maybe reducing my spending a little, and I draw down my checking account. Okay? Am I, and you go, well, that's not sustainable, right? Okay, and now let's think about two things. First of all, I could say, well, okay, I'm going to go take some of that money that I've been saving in this big retirement account, and I'll use that. Well, first of all, we would agree that if I don't change how much I'm spending, or I don't change how much I'm earning and go get a different job that earns more, I haven't actually changed my fiscal situation. What really matters is the total amount that I'm spending and the total amount that I'm earning. And the real health of my fiscal circumstances is, does whatever my investments might be earning plus whatever I'm earning in my job, how does that compare with what I'm spending? That's the only test of whether what I'm spending is sustainable. Our long-term, the way I think, a lot of people say, here's our fiscal problem, and I'm guilty of saying this too. Here's our fiscal problem. Our general fund spending is way more than our general fund revenues. But I think the real question is, how does your total spending compare with your total revenues? And our long-term fiscal challenge is that our total spending for government and dividends combined exceeds our total unrestricted general fund and permanent fund revenues. And we've been drawing down our total savings. Using permanent fund earnings to help pay for government doesn't in itself address our long-term fiscal challenge. You haven't solved anything if you sort of say, well, I'm going to stop drawing down my checking account by taking out of my, taking it from under the pillow. The only changes to our revenues or our spending for government and or dividends address our long-term fiscal challenge. It's not what place you take the money from that matters. It's how much you spend and how much you're earning in total. And at the risk of completely frightening you with this horrible graph, this illustrates this. Before I showed you just part of this graph. Here was the non-oil revenues and the oil revenues, and I compared those with operations spending and total unrestricted general fund spending. But here I've added in the permanent fund realized earnings, and I've added in the total spending including dividends. And you can see that, can't see very easily, the total spending including dividends for the past 3 years has significantly exceeded our total revenues including permanent fund earnings. Our total FY17 spending, dividends and general fund combined, is $1.8 billion more than our total revenues. That's a better measure of our actual fiscal challenge. And the fact that that's happening is reflected in the fact that since 2014, we've been drawing down the total value of our funds. So this part of this graph is what I showed you before, just down to here, the savings reserve funds. This is the permanent fund earnings reserve. That's been growing, but these sort of easily accessible cash funds, even with a growing permanent fund earnings reserve, have been declining. And even with a growing permanent fund principal, the total value of our funds has been declining. And with the declining total value of the funds, your investment earnings will decline over time. That's our real fiscal challenge. Now, if you just think about it mathematically, over any given period, our total revenues from all sources, existing and new, minus our total spending of all kinds, government and dividends, mathematically that equals our total savings in all funds. CBRF, Constitutional Budget Reserve, Permanent Fund, and other funds. So over any given period, given our projected existing revenues, we face a direct trade-off between new revenues, government spending, dividend spending, and how much we save in all of our funds. How much government spending we can have is limited by the extent to which we're willing to raise new revenues, reduce dividend spending, or save less. How much dividends we can have is directly limited by the extent to which we're willing to raise new revenues, reduce government spending, or reduce our savings, and so on. There's just there's a direct trade-off. Every dollar that we spend or collect in any one of these categories directly affects what's our ability to do something. If every dollar of dividend spending affects either the government spending we can have, how much new revenues we have to raise, or the how much less we're going to save or more we're going to take out of our savings. So I developed a simple model to kind of illustrate some of the implications of this. And it's sort of a way of thinking in a very simple way about our options. And it illustrates a way of framing our fiscal choices in terms of 4 broad questions, which I won't list these here. I'm going to talk about them one at a time. And this is sort of what I hope is a structured way of formulating the problem we face and thinking about the choices. So the first question is, what assumptions about future revenues from existing sources should we base our fiscal planning on? It's an exact analogy. Suppose you go to a financial planner and you say, hey, I need a financial plan for my personal finances. You know, I want to know how much I can spend. I want to know if I can afford this house. I want to know if my kid's going to be able to go to college. The first question the planner is going to ask is, well, how much do you expect to be earning? How much money do you expect to take in, from your job? What's the risk that you'll lose your job? How much are your investments going to earn? That constrains what your options are. So that's the first question we should think about. But the answer to this is not obvious. our existing revenue sources, basically, our future revenue options depend on our future oil revenues, which depend on oil prices and production, whatever they'll be, and our future investment returns, which depend on the permanent fund rates of return, as well as how much we save, which affects what that return is earned on. And it is not obvious what assumptions we should base our fiscal plans on. Now, I'm going to make a point that is important that has not been emphasized enough. And this is the important point. The issue is not only what revenues are most likely. The issue is what assumptions about our future revenues are most prudent to base our planning on. So if my financial planner, if he says, well, how much do you expect to earn? And I say, well, I think most likely I'm going to be in this job, for a while, and my salary is going to go up like this, and that's my projected future revenues. However, they're talking about maybe shutting down the company, and there's sort of a 20% chance I might lose my job. Well, maybe I should make a different choice about how much to spend on a house, how much to spend on a car, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just what's most likely, it's what assumptions are the right ones to use in making important plans that affect our future. That's not obvious. Most of the fiscal debate we hear is based on two assumptions. Whatever the Department of Revenue has most recently proclaimed is the sort of 10-year oil revenue projections, and whatever the Permanent Fund Corporation's average rate of return assumptions are. And 95% of the debate that you hear in discussion is based as if people were assuming that that was true, and we should base our planning on that. And yet, actual oil prices have almost always differed drastically from what our Department of Revenue has based its projections on after just a few years. We're never right. They never come true. They always differ significantly. We just, unfortunately, don't know which way. And our actual oil revenues have almost always differed drastically from what the Department of Revenue projected just a few years ago. Just in case you haven't been following it, what these lines are, these lines show, as of each year, what the Department of Revenue projected our future oil, unrestricted general fund revenues would be for the next 10 years. And the yellow lines show what actually came to pass. It's always wrong. It's always wrong by 20, 30, 40, 50%, and sometimes it's too high and sometimes it's too low. So what that means is we should not believe that those Department of Revenue projections are going to come true. So what do you do when you don't know what's going to happen? I think what you do is you sort of explore what would be the implications of different things that might happen, that could happen, and you think, well, how would my fiscal plan work out if that happened? And then what assumption do I think is most prudent? And for purposes of illustration in this simple talk, I came up with four future revenue scenarios that correspond to four different assumptions about what might happen to future oil prices. And by the way, this is the Department of Revenue's spring and fall projections. Except for this year, they're almost identical. But Brad Keithley was here a few weeks ago, I gather, and sort of said, well, he thinks the state's revenue assumptions are too pessimistic, and he points to the Energy Information Administration is projecting much higher prices will rise much more rapidly than the state is. And so here is roughly, if those Energy Information Administration project prices came true, how much revenue the state might take in, $1 billion more than what the Department of Revenue's projecting. On the other hand, if prices don't rise like the Department of Revenue is projecting and hold flat at $60, then with declining declining production, our oil revenues would decline. Any of these could happen. No one knows for sure what will happen. So we're left with this fix. What did we base our planning on? Historically, the permanent fund rates of return have always fluctuated widely. They've never been steady like our assumptions are based on. Also the long-term rates of return are by no means guaranteed to be the same as they've been in the past. So again, we're left with real significant uncertainty about what rates of return we might earn. And so I'm going to illustrate the implications of 3 different sets of assumptions about future permanent fund rates of return and inflation, which are basically their standard assumptions and 1% lower and 1% higher. Okay? This is a point that I'm going to argue for. It's so difficult to predict our oil revenues or investment returns. We're left with this problem. Well, what should we be assuming as we do planning? And I don't know what the answer is, but I'll say this. It should not be just one set of assumptions. We should have a much, much more robust issue. Where have been the legislative hearings bringing in all the experts from our own state and around the country and the world to advise us on what kind of future we might be looking at? How can something so important to our future not get more attention and more discussion, not just of what might happen, but discussion of, well, what is a prudent assumption to base your planning on? How can you not think about that? We ought to have much more analysis and discussion of the outlook for our future revenues and what assumptions we should base our fiscal planning on. Whoops. Oh dear, I've messed up. We'll have to call it quits. Let's go get a beer. Sorry, I turned. One little. Okay, good. Okay. So, question 1 for a structured approach to fiscal planning is think about your assumptions. Question 2 is, given our assumptions about revenues from existing sources, what are what I'm calling, for want of a better term, and I'm sure there's got to be a better term, what are sustainable existing revenues? What do I mean by sustainable existing revenues? That's a technical term which I define as the total level of spending existing revenues could support, which would keep the inflation-adjusted total value of all our funds unchanged. In other words, if we wanted to not draw down the real value of our savings or not grow them, and we were only spending existing revenues, how much could we spend on a sustainable basis? Okay? And that's what I'm calling sustainable existing revenues. Okay, so I made a little model to calculate that, and I won't bore you with the Excel details of how I calculated it. But first I said, okay, basically it looks like this. Here's an example using the fall 2016 oil revenue projections. The blue line shows what the projections are in nominal dollars. The line below it shows what the projections are in real dollars. And then the stable line labeled 1807 shows what a sustainable level of revenues, if you sort of, what would produce the same sort of ending result. You know, it's translating, the problem is, to simplify thinking, translating revenues which are going to vary over time to what is their constant sustainable equivalent. Now, what are sustainable existing unrestricted general fund revenues? It depends on what you assume about prices. If you assume the fall 2016 revenue projections, it would be $1.8 billion a year, as shown in that graph. If you assume a flat $60 price, it would be $1.6 billion a year. If you assume the Energy Information Administration price, it would be $2.3 billion a year. It makes a $500 million difference. We don't know, but this sort of shows you what the range might be. Now, how about calculating sustainable permanent fund earnings? I went through the same exercise, and it's kind of complicated. And basically I said, what is the total annual real draw you could take from the permanent fund, which preserves the value of the permanent fund, as well as the several $100 million in annual royalty contributions that we're making over time, on the theory that we ought to be preserving that too, because that's supposed to be saving for the future. And this is the numbers you come up with. If you assume the permanent fund corporation's rate of return assumptions, it's $2.5 billion. If earnings average 1% less, it's 1.97 or 2. And if earnings average 1% higher, it's 3. 1% difference in return makes a $500 million difference. Okay? Now, if you combine these two sets of assumptions, this is assumptions about earnings, and these different colors represent assumptions about the rates of return, and then these colors represent different assumptions about oil revenues. It shows you what might be different resulting sustainable existing revenues. And I'm going to talk about the 4.322 that's shown in the middle, which you might call a base case assumption of what would be the sustainable existing revenues if the Department of Revenue's fall 16 revenue projections came true, and if the permanent fund corporation's rate of return came true. 4.3 billion would be sustainable existing revenues. Okay, after you go through that exercise, you say, well, given sustainable existing revenues, what are the feasible combinations of new revenues, government spending, dividend spending, and total savings? And this is simple math. And this is just illustrated. Basically, if you assume the numbers that I showed, the standard assumptions that are most commonly assumed, then sustainable existing revenues would be 4.3 billion, which just coincidentally happens to be about the level of this year's general fund budget. Okay? So that means we could sustain total annual spending of 4.3 million and maintain the real value of our funds without adding new revenues. But remember, total annual spending is the total spending for government and dividends. So what are some options we have? Well, if we want to maintain the value of our funds, we face a direct trade-off between what we spend for government, what we spend for dividends, and new revenues that we collect. If we can maintain this year's government spending of 4.3 billion, we can sustain that if we pay 0 dividends and collect no new revenues. If we're going to say, well, no, we refuse to have new revenues, but we want to pay a $1,000 dividend, which would cost $610 million, then we can only sustain 3.7 billion in spending. If we want to pay a $2,000 dividend, sort of roughly what the current formula would predict, and we don't want to pay new revenues, we can only spend 3.1 billion. That's the nature of the direct trade-offs we face if we want to maintain the value of our funds. On the other hand, we can go outside of this box. We can have no new revenues and dividends and spending if we draw down the level of our savings. We can spend as much as we want for a little while, if we're willing to draw down the level of our savings. So that's the trade-off we're facing. Any combination of government and dividend spending which exceeds 4.3 billion without corresponding new revenues would deplete the real value of our funds, if those revenue assumptions are correct, if our future oil revenue assumptions and rate of return assumptions are correct. So, question 4 is, which of the feasible combinations do we wish to choose? There's sort of this is the range of feasible combinations. There's this direct trade-off. So where do we choose? Well, these are political choices. These are important choices. Reasonable people can and do disagree about what is the right choice. Some people think the choice should be a high level of government and they're willing to pay, they think we should pay high taxes to support it. Other people say we should have a high dividend, maintain the current dividend, and we should either pay taxes to support it or cut government spending to support it. And we should be having a healthy debate about the merits of those different arguments. But the debate has to be grounded in the reality of the real trade-offs we face. We shouldn't be debating about what fiscal reality is. We should try to, even with our different political values, we ought to be trying to get to sit there and say, what are the actual numbers? What are reasonable assumptions? And given those assumptions, what choice do we want to make? And part of this fiscal reality, part of it is that our options have changed drastically from what they've been for almost as long as most Alaskans can remember. So most Alaskans, as long as I can remember, we've never had to pay significant broad-based taxes for government. And we have expected a dividend based on a particular formula. But fiscal reality is we can't sustain that and the level of anywhere near the level of government services we've had, given what's happened to our oil revenues, and not deplete our funds. That's the new reality which we sort of have to come to accept. Okay, it's my attempt to sort of suggest a way of framing the discussion that we need to have and what our options are. Now I want to give a few final closing comments because I was supposed to finish by now, so I'll try to wrap these up real quickly. Here's my first comment. We face real trade-offs. And the first thing I want to think, I hope is pretty basic. This is not simple choices. There's a lot of stuff we should consider. You can't decide what's the right choice based on one single dimension. Part of the things we should be thinking about include, but are not limited, how fair would be different choices to different Alaskans. How will our choices affect future Alaskans? How will our choices affect our economy in the short run? How will our choices affect our economy in the long run? How might our choices affect how Alaskans engage with government? All these things ought to be part of our debate, and not any single one of these. Now, I note that Brad Keithley was here a few weeks ago referring to a report that I authored last year at ICER, in which we looked at short-term economic impacts of Alaska fiscal options. And we came to some conclusions about how much sort of going different extent in these, with these different choices, how they would affect the economy in the short run in terms of jobs and income. But Brad Keithley has been arguing, and a number of other people have been arguing, that the economic effects in the short run therefore ought to drive what our choices are. And our economy is hurting at the moment, so some people have argued, since the economy is hurting, we should do what causes the least harm to our economy at the moment. But I don't buy that. I think that is an incorrect and invalid overuse of what this study can tell you. It's relevant, but it's by no means the only thing that's relevant as we think about our fiscal choices. And I went to some pains in that study to write, and I also testified exactly with this slide to the Senate Finance Committee, that our study only looked at short-run direct economic impacts, and there was a tremendous number of other things that we didn't study but that were important. If you're considering whether to tax people or lay off a government worker or reduce dividends or reduce government spending, and you're worried about economic impacts, the economic impact is not, if you reduce a government program, the economic impact is not just that worker's out of a job. The economic impact is whatever the relationship was between that government service and the economy. If you say, oh, we'll cut the tourism marketing budget, well, and so you lay off 2 people that do tourism marketing, well, the economic impacts may be vastly greater if no tourists come. You know, it's not, the issue is not, when you have government programs, they're not there for the purpose of stimulating the economy, or you don't cut them based on how much cutting them will or won't. You ought to be thinking about, what do those programs do for us? Are they worth the cost given our constrained resources? And some kinds of cuts can have vastly amplified economic effects in the short run, not to mention the long run. If you don't plow the roads and nobody can get to work, that is a big economic effect, way bigger than the snowplow drivers that were laid off. But in particular, in the long run, our spending decisions have the potential to greatly affect the course of our future economy. Our economy will be affected by the kinds of schools we have, by the kind of university we have, by the kind of roads we build, by how we maintain our public infrastructure, by how safe our society is, by our parks. All these things will affect our economy and our society. We ought to be discussing all that. And it's big and complicated, right? It's big and complicated, which is why we should have been discussing this a long time ago and a lot more carefully than the simplistic debates that so much of this fiscal challenge debate has reflected. I just want to give a few final comments. What have we done for the past 3 years? And what may well happen this fiscal situation if the House and Senate this legislature, if the House and Senate can't reach agreement? Our default solution is go to the savings, draw down the savings. And now the rationalization's being added. Well, we don't want to fully solve the deficit problem because that'll hurt the economy. Drawing down our savings has had and will continue to have the least current economic impact. It'll be the least noted choice, least noticed choice by Alaskans. It'll cause the least political pain, but it may cause the biggest long-term harm to Alaska. We draw down our savings, what will happen? We'll have, directly in proportion to the amount that we lower our savings, we lower our future investment returns, we lower our kids' options. Okay? I don't have to endure any economic pain as long as I don't want to leave any inheritance to my kids. Another comment I want to make is that cuts are not real unless they're specified. So a lot of people are talking about, well, the solution to our fiscal challenge is we need to cut more. Government's bloated, we need to cut more. But unless you specify, everybody agrees we need to cut more, but people don't agree about what they need to cut. So if you say 90% of Alaskans think cuts are needed, that doesn't mean that a majority will agree on any particular cut. And if a cut is not feasible, it's not real. And if a cut is not real, it is spending down your savings. If you run a deficit because you said you were going to cut and you don't cut, which is, by the way, what we've been doing for the past 4 years, you are default spending down your savings. Talking about cuts, unless you can actually make them happen, they're not real. A third comment is that paying taxes wouldn't kill us. In some ways, paying taxes would even benefit us beyond the fact that it might give us revenues that we could use to address our problem. Believe it or not, I've been to a few of the other 49 states, every one of which has a broad-based tax of some sort that their citizens pay. And I haven't noticed all the factories shut and the children crying on the streets. Their economies seem to function. A reasonable level of taxes can be supported by a healthy economy. Of course, you can overdo it. Okay, but the idea that any level of taxes would kill our economy is not viable. And in addition, there are advantages to paying taxes. And one is people become engaged when they pay taxes. They pay attention to spending. A lot of people say Alaskans won't pay taxes until they see spending cut. And I kind of wonder whether the opposite may be true. Alaskans won't cut spending until they have to pay taxes. People in Anchorage pay damn close attention to the decisions of the Anchorage municipality because they're paying property taxes. And they think about every single fiscal decision and it gets a lot of scrutiny. How much attention do any of us, even now, pay to what the government's actually spending? If we paid taxes and knew that we were paying for it, we would probably pay closer attention. And in addition, the fact that we don't pay taxes in Alaska, broad-based taxes, causes what economists call the Alaska disconnect, which means that if General Motors comes to Alaska and or Toyota or whoever comes to Alaska and says, we're going to save you, we're going to build a giant factory to build all our new cars here, but if we have no taxes, then all those workers building all those cars have kids that need schools and all this and parks and roads and so on, but they don't pay taxes, so we've got more expenses for government, but no revenues. A healthy economy is pay as you go. If it grows, it generates additional revenues, but we have a disconnect in Alaska. We don't have that. And this is my final slide. What does our fiscal challenge demand of us? It demands that all of us get informed about the basic fiscal reality and stop insisting on don't do anything that would cause me harm. That's unrealistic. And by the way, we all need to recognize that no one gets everything they want in a democracy. Of people that are advocating, whatever you're advocating for, you need to advocate for what you propose to do to address this problem, not what you oppose. It's not good enough to say, and we should not let people get away with saying, we shouldn't cut dividends, or we shouldn't pay taxes, or we shouldn't cut schools, or we shouldn't cut the university. Hey, reality's changed. We have drastically less money. We have to do something. What is your solution? People should get a place at the table only if they are willing to state a solution. And I'll give credit, in the legislature, a number of people come forward with pretty different decisions, but different recommendations or proposals that are actually real options. And those are what the debate needs to focus on. And of our elected leaders, that I've run over my time, as I always do. I'll stop, and I'd be glad to take questions in our remaining 25 minutes or so. Thanks. Sir.
At one point, you used the term prudent to evaluate some of those choices. So, for example, you based the last part of your fiscal conversation on the DOR projections and the permanent fund median estimate. But can you talk more about whether that's a prudent choice?
Well, I think prudent is in the eye of the beholder, and we need to have a political debate about that. Okay. Basically, the more optimistic we choose to be in our revenue assumptions, the less, if we say, oh, this is going to happen, I'm going to base my plan on this, the less pain we have to suffer. And if it comes true, the less needless pain we'll have suffered. On the other hand, if we're overly optimistic and the assumptions don't pan out, then we will have sort of put ourselves in a hole. Okay, just like if you buy a house, if you're struggling with, can I afford this house? Well, what do I assume about my future revenues? What's prudent? Prudent is, it depends in a sort of, what kind of risks are you personally willing to take in that kind of situation? What kind of risks should we be willing to take as a state? There is no correct answer. It's a debate. It's a trade-off between how certain we can be that we're really fixing our problems versus how the risk of being unnecessarily stingy. I mean, I can make sure I can always afford my mortgage payment if I, buy a shack. So I don't need to be 100% sure, but I probably shouldn't go out and buy a mansion unless I'm really sure that I'm going to, make those big bucks. Oh, I'll let you decide, yeah.
Hi, Gunnar. Dana Thomas. Thank you for your presentation. Really appreciated. I like the fact that you varied the underlying assumptions there for both returns and for the oil revenue. Very valuable. One thing that bothers me about this, and maybe you've done it, and I don't know, and that's what I'm interested in hearing. So when I invest my retirement savings, they run a simulation based on rates of return, that tells me if I have a 90% chance of lasting, and my money lasts until age 100, okay? We can do the same thing with simulation here on rates of return, prices of oil. We can just simulate from existing values, as you know. Is anybody doing that? Because then we could talk about, what are the odds of making it 50 years with this kind of model?
There's been some work along those lines within the Department of Revenue, and part of what you're doing is sometimes technically goes by the name of Monte Carlo analysis and other kinds of things. You sort of simulate the way things might work out, and you can. There's been some work, but you would agree the mere fact that you don't know if anybody's doing it means it is not part of our fiscal discussion. If they've got a light, they're hiding it under a barrel. And so I'm not saying we necessarily need to go to, I personally think it could be quite useful to do exactly this kind of analysis that you're talking about, which requires real research, not retired old me doing stuff on the back of the envelope. But I think that it would be, I lament that I don't see this kind of systematic approach to such a critical issue, when even for just an individual retirement issue, your retirement planner will actually do that. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, you have to be aware that there are limitations to what you can learn given the fundamental uncertainty, in particular of oil prices. Whatever you do, never get yourself in a position where you're dependent on oil prices.
Sir.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at the end there, you mentioned how we could fund out of savings, but you didn't mention funding out of savings on a cyclical basis where, like we did in the past that you showed in a much earlier slide, where after the fact it was seen that we were spending less and then spending more and saving into our savings account when it was good and then spending out of those savings account when it was bad. So at the end, though, you just ended up with, I wouldn't call it flat line, but a pretty linear, almost linear deal with, of course, the DOR 16. But it's a much different, if you're looking at the fact that you know that oil prices are going to change over time in both directions in ways we can't predict. And so bringing in the cyclical nature of using that savings, running a structured deficit, and then filling it back up when good, seems like that changes the argument. That's what your colleague Mr.
No, I don't think that it changes it. I'm saying if you think that the future is going to be ups and downs, okay, then the what I called the sustainable existing revenue would be, a level of revenue they would bring you on a sustainable basis with more, where you could spend more in the years when they were down and less in the years when they were up. But the problem is we're sort of limited by uncertainty. But in theory, the approach I'm using ought to do that. So yeah, it's totally reasonable in any given year in my personal finances or in the state's finances to spend more than we take in, as long as we're doing that on a sustainable basis where it's reasonable to expect that that will be made up within a reasonable period of time by other years. But by the way, just to elaborate on that, if your strategy is we'll spend from our savings when revenues are low, and we'll save when revenues are high. That depends on having the discipline to actually save when revenues are high, instead of saying, oh, we're rich, let's spend more.
Yeah, thank you again for your talk. Last year I asked you a question about the assumptions on what it costs for government. And you mentioned that ICER was working on a report that was going to look at the cost of doing business in Alaska versus the cost in other states. And I just wonder if you have an update for us on that.
Alas, we haven't finished that report, although they haven't. I'm retired. What do I care? No, I believe they're still working on it, but it's not done. It is one of many, many kinds of analysis that ought to be done to inform our discussion. That said, there are very significant practical problems in a lot of us are grappling with this question of sort of what is the right level of government and how can we get insight into this? And so we say, well, let's look at what other states spend. But as soon as you start doing that, you start realizing, well, we spend more on fish and game management than Delaware because, we got a lot more fish and game than Delaware. And so that doesn't, and we spend more on land management, we spend more on heating, but, because our situation is different. And then, and even if you just look at one particular part of our spending, like and the university does this from time to time, they sort of compare what do we spend to provide a university education compared with other institutions, and they try to do that, and they discover, well, actually it's not really comparable because, well, like, UAF costs more to heat than University of Florida. And so it's a worthy exercise. We should try to gain insight from that to see where we might be over budgeted, but we shouldn't expect that to tell us the right level of government.
Yes, Gunnar, thanks for your big picture perspective about total revenues, total expenses. And I certainly support use of the permanent fund asset, to help bridge this gap. But I'm a little concerned about the use of the realized earnings element of it in terms of if it's supposed to be long-term investments, long-term appreciation, forcing churn or forcing. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I want to distinguish between. First of all, I think that what really matters and a better approach for this analysis is our total earnings. Okay, and I think that there are all kinds of perverse risks from basing our use of our earnings on realized earnings, which is a peculiar thing, because it can lead to, oh, we need money now, let's sell the stock that has the greatest promise to bring us returns in the future. Okay, for those of you who aren't following this discussion, there's a feature of our dividend formula. We've gotten in the habit of thinking of our dividend formula is based on realized earnings of the permanent fund, but there's a lot of people that say that's not really the right way to manage a big investment or draw from it, and which is why I think both bills that passed House and Senate are based on a percentage of market value approach. The rest of your question, I didn't completely follow it, and second, it's complex, but we can talk more.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I don't think I need this thing. Well, maybe I do. Gunnar, nice to see you again. Thank you. I'd like to focus on where we are today. And we have a food fight going on in Juneau. And I'd like to offer humbly a path out of there. And I think that the discussion how to get them out of there now bears on how we move ahead. And there's a lot to say here, but I just want to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to follow on, and I'm going to give you 3 examples, and it all talks about using the earnings of the permanent fund. And whenever you would ever say that, it was like you had 2 heads, and darned if right now we don't have 2 houses in the legislature that have both agreed. That's a seminal event in our state's history, as you've said. So the first thing you say is, well, what happens to my check? So I asked the permanent fund division, and some years ago, but certainly in September of 15, and now as recently as this year. And I have, what I'm going to just give you examples of is based on these pages, and these are pages April 4th of this year. The title of it is Financial Projections, Comparison of the Alaska Permanent Fund with Various Appropriations out of the General Fund. So I made up a little chart. I only made a few because I didn't want you to pick them up and throw them at me. So, but I want to give you 3 examples of what that means. My way out of Juneau involves $500 million from the CBR. It also involves some other things aren't important right now, but it also involves $2 billion out of the earnings reserve. First thing people say, well, what does that do to my check? Well, here, if you took $2 billion out of the earnings reserve account every year for the next 5 years, your check in 2018 would be less than $1 smaller. In 2019, it would be $22 smaller. Over 5 years, it would be a cumulative of $420 smaller. If you didn't take that $2 billion, you would put in your pocket $13,087 in permanent fund checks. If you did take that $2 billion to help the general fund, you would put in your pocket $12,667. That's a delta of $420. If you did that, the earnings reserve runs out, this is according to the permanent fund, in 2025. So think about that. And now, let's use another example. We haven't spent squat on capital. Many in this room know that. We have a $409 million average capital budget the last 25 years. We're spending 110. I mean, the state's crumbling. So let's just say we ask the legislators to go to the permanent fund earnings and withdraw $500 million. Do a capital budget that's funded at $500 million. Here's what that means to each one of us. First year, less than $1. Second year, that would cost you $7. Over a period of 5 years, your check would be $106 less over 5 years. $12,981 versus $13,087. So the cost to every one of us for a $500 million capital budget over the next 5 years is $106 5 years from now. That's powerful. That is what we don't think about is that we have $59 billion managed by the world's best money managers to benefit 635,000 people that happen to file for permanent fund dividend. This is the power of earnings. Mike Burns, the executive director, God rest his soul, proclaimed this thing as a self-licking ice cream cone. And that's exactly what it is. You take $1 out and you put $1.05 back in because of the power of earnings. It's not like the CBR. You don't take $500 million out and nothing goes back in unless prices go crazy again. This thing keeps replenishing itself. It's the power of earnings. Let's look at the income tax proposal. This is stale dated August 8, 2015, but the numbers are rough. First year, less than $1, $655 million. Second year, $8. And overall, $140. So what that says is we can go to the small businesses, we can go to the working families, we can go to the pensioners, and we can get thousands of dollars out of them to raise $655 million every year. Or we can push one button on the computer, lower the permanent fund earnings to $655 million, take that out every year for 5 years, costs you $140, every one of us in Alaska. So I've said enough, but Gunnar has set this up absolutely right. We are moving from an oil-based economy to an investment-based economy. The permanent fund earnings are the bedrock of our economy, and we shouldn't be afraid to spend them as long as we don't spend them down, and that's the important part. So I made a few copies. If anybody's interested, I got more, but please, we should remember what we have as Alaskans, and to ignore the power of that asset sitting there spinning off. Every one of us today has a $90,000 investment managed by the world's best money managers. Every one of us should give up a little bit of that, and it's not much, to fund government. So Thank you. I didn't mean to take all that time, but I just wanted to get that out. Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
All right, Gunnar, I just wanted to say that to thank you. The quality of your presentations the sophistication of those analysis has gotten tremendously better. Not that they weren't good to begin with. I don't mean that, but including inflation and and those charts, particularly chart 26, page 26, and those, I think that's really a great deal of important information that we haven't really swallowed. One, and I think you were getting at this, the oil revenue forecast for many years was a low, medium, and high forecast, in which we abandoned that about 20 years ago, I think. I'm not sure exactly when. It seems like we could have low, medium, and high forecasts, not only on oil, but on investment returns, as opposed to fixating on a single number that is never accurate. I mean, and this is in a world where we can't predict the weather. We sure can't predict this kind of stuff either.
That wouldn't. Gentleman over here talked about could we run a sophisticated Monte Carlo analysis to sort of show us all the probabilities. We could. That might be sort of the ideal way to really engage that discussion, but it would be a great step forward compared to a single projection report to at least sort of say, here's a few examples of what revenues could be under some, that you might want to think about, and sort of here's what could lead to them. If it could just get people remembering that the future is not certain, our future revenues are not definitely whatever this projection is. They might be lower, they might be higher, and now, unfortunately, that makes it harder to think through your choices, but you're more likely to think through them in a correct way.
Thank you, Gunnar. Really, Gunnar, as you know, is very generous with his time. He comes up here on his own nickel, and he's talking about, what do we do in Alaska? What do we do in Alaska? Because he's passionate about it. He raises his family here. He lives here. So, it's our collective decision, and the fact that the dollar issues are what they are, how we put those dollars together and reach a solution is what we ought to be debating. So, Gunnar, again, thank you, and thank you for coming to Fairbanks. Nice sunny day. We wish it was warmer, but it is what it is. And we will keep trying to inform you where we can, where we find people that want to talk. I am going to create a special program for Gary, so he can put on his program, and I'm gonna drag him up here and have him stand and tell you, what he thinks. He's as all of you know, Gary has been a major contributor to Alaska and to our community over the years. We're darn lucky to have him. I do like to tease him, but we're darn lucky to have him. Thank you, Gary. With that, we have a 50-50 drawing winner here. The ticket has been drawn. The number is 568957. 957, and the mayor won, and I just got to tell you, the mayor was sick for a few days this week, so he didn't get paid for those days. So this is really going to help. Thank you for coming, and we will. I think with Gunnar's permission, we will have the presentation on the chambers. On the Chamber's website and the FEDC's website. So any of you that want to get a copy of the presentation, look up the numbers. It'll be there in just probably by tomorrow. Okay, thanks again.
Thanks. Have a great day. Thank you. Sure. Well, sort of went on and on and on and on.